Three methods: lime, timber, and neighbor labor. That is the Amish building formula that collapses hard costs to almost nothing. In Lancaster County, a 3,000 square foot barn went up in a single Saturday with a material bill under $2,000. English contractors would charge $80,000 for the same structure, not 80. And the same three-part system still works today on any quarter-acre lot in any state. So the real question is, why every county once knew this, and why by 1955 it had almost vanished? Stay with me, because this is not folklore. This is not a rural fantasy. This is a system with real anchors, real dates, and real documents behind it. And the first anchor is the cost gap itself. When an English family builds a shed, they pay for engineered lumber that was trucked in from 3 states away, for stamped concrete mixed at a plant 30 miles down the road, and for labor billed at $70 an hour. When an Amish family builds the same shed, they pay for none of that. The lumber is standing on the back of the property. The binder is being slaked in a wooden barrel behind the workshop. The labor is a group of neighbors who owe a day and know they will be owed one back. That gap is not small. That gap is not a rounding error. That gap is a system. And a shed is only the beginning. The same 3-method scale: a workshop, an addition, a guest cabin, a full, small home. The Amish put up 2-story houses using this exact formula, and they do it without a mortgage, without a construction loan, and without a contractor pulling permits in 3 different offices. A young couple in an Amish community can start married life in a house that is fully paid for on the day they move in. Think about that. Fully paid for. No 30-year note. No escrow. No refinance. Just walls, a roof, and a life that begins in the black instead of the red. And the whole reason that is possible is the same reason the English family down the road is paying $80,000 for a barn. One system runs on money that leaves the community. The other system runs on materials and labor that never leave the community in the first place. And here's the detail that matters. There was once a Department of Agriculture pamphlet, published in 1943, that laid all 3 of these methods out on paper. It was a farmer's bulletin, distributed through county extension offices, and it treated lime construction, on-site timber, and community raisings as ordinary rural practice. Ordinary, not exotic, not fringe, not Amish curiosity. Just the way most Americans still built things when they were paying for the build themselves. That pamphlet existed. It was printed by the federal government. And somewhere between 1953 and 1958, it quietly stopped being reprinted. Nobody announced it. Nobody protested. It just stopped. Hold that year in your head. We will come back to it. Now walk with the narrator for a moment. Picture a small workshop set back from a 2-lane road in central Pennsylvania. The doors are open. Inside, there's an old wooden barrel, maybe 4 feet tall. Its staves darkened from years of use. A man in his 60s stands beside it with a long wooden paddle. He is stirring slowly. The mixture in the barrel is white and thick, almost the color of fresh cream, and it lets off a faint, warm smell of chalk and stone. What he is stirring is slaked lime. And what he is making, with nothing more than that lime, some sand, and water, is a binder that will hold together the walls of a building his grandchildren will still be using. This is method 1. Lime plus sand plus water. That is the formula in broad strokes, and it is the same formula the Romans used to build the aqueducts. It is the same formula that holds together the walls of Independence Hall. It is the same formula behind the dome of the Pantheon in Rome, a structure that has stood for almost 1,900 years without a single steel bar inside it. Lime does not just harden, it breathes. It absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and slowly turns back into the stone it came from. It self-heals, hairline cracks. It outlasts modern Portland cement by centuries. And here is the part nobody tells you. It costs a fraction of what ready-mix concrete costs at the hardware store. because a bag of hydrated lime in a pile of sand does not require an industrial supply chain to produce. Foundations, wall coatings, mortar joints, root cellars, cisterns. All of it can be built with this one binder for pennies on the dollar compared to what a modern builder would spend. The Amish know this. Their grandparents knew this. Your great-grandparents almost certainly knew this. And 2,000 years of European and American construction confirms it every time an archaeologist digs up another intact Roman wall. Walk through any Pennsylvania Dutch farmstead built before 1900, and you are walking through this material. The stone foundations of the old bank barns, the plastered walls of the spring houses, the mortar between the field stones in the smokehouse, all lime, all still holding. And if you head down to Charleston or Savannah or the older neighborhoods of Boston and Philadelphia, you can lay a hand on brick walls that were laid up 250 years ago with the same binder, and those walls are still square, still standing, still shrugging off hurricanes that flatten modern buildings around them. There is a reason for that, and the reason is not luck. Lime moves with the building. Portland cement fights the building. And over enough winters, the fight always ends the same way, with cracks running through the concrete and water finding its way in. So the question sharpens. If this material is older than the United States itself, if it holds up better than concrete, if it costs less than concrete, if it is legal to buy and mix and use in every state in the country, then why did it vanish from the American job site in one specific decade? Why is it now considered exotic? Why do most contractors under 50 not even know how to work with it? Notice what happens next. The disappearance of lime was not a single event. It was a slow substitution. Portland cement began replacing lime mortar in commercial construction in the early 1900s because it hardened faster and let builders finish projects on tighter timelines. Faster meant cheaper labor costs per job. Faster meant more jobs per season. Faster meant more product moved by the cement industry. And by the 1930s, Portland was the default in cities. But the countryside held on to lime. Farmers kept mixing it. Amish and Mennonite communities kept using it. Old Masons kept teaching it. Then something shifted after the war, and the countryside started forgetting too. That shift is where this story really begins, and we will get to who caused it. But first, walk back outside the workshop, because there's a second method waiting on the other side of the property. This is method 2. Behind the workshop, past the garden and the drying racks, there's a stand of oak and poplar. Not planted, not managed. Just standing there the way trees stand on almost any wooded property in America. And when the Amish need timber, they walk into that stand with a chainsaw and a portable sawmill, and they turn those trees into framing lumber on the spot. The sawmill is not exotic. It is a wood miser, or a Norwood, or a homemade rig built off a plane from a rural magazine. It costs less than a used pickup truck. It fits on a trailer. It pays for itself in a single build. The wood that comes off it is green, fresh cut, full of moisture. And here's where the modern builder scoffs. Because modern code assumes lumber must be kiln dried and stamped by an approved inspection agency before it can be used to frame a house. But the Amish are not framing under that code. They are framing under an older code. Green timber shrinks in predictable directions. Traditional joinery accounts for that shrinkage. A mortise cut a 1/4 inch loose today will be tight in 18 months. A tenon driven in green will lock permanently as the wood dries around it. Barns built this way in the 1800s are still standing, still square, still holding roofs. This is the empowerment moment. The wood is already on your land. If you have a wooded 1/4 acre, you almost certainly have more framing lumber standing on it than a 2-bedroom house requires. You do not need to buy it. You do not need to have it delivered. You do not need to pay someone to grade it. You need a saw, a mill, and the knowledge that green wood was the default building material of this country for 200 years before anyone invented a lumber yard. Think about that phrase. before anyone invented a lumber yard, because the lumber yard is not ancient. The lumber yard is a 19th and 20th century business model that inserted itself between the tree and the builder, and then convinced everyone that going straight from tree to builder was reckless. It was not reckless. It was the default. It was how the log cabin got built, how the settler farmhouse got built, how every barn you can still see leaning in an old pasture got built. The trees, the saw, and the builder were all in one loop. And the loop was closed. No money leaked out of it. So why does modern code require stamped, kiln-dried, graded lumber for almost every residential build? Hold on to that question because the answer has a year attached to it. That year is 1947. In 1947, the American Lumber Standard Committee, working under the pressure of the United States Commerce Department, finalized the grading system that made stamped lumber the legal default for residential construction in most of the country. Before that year, on-site milled wood was normal. After that year, it started becoming a liability. Insurance companies stopped covering owner-built structures made from ungraded timber. Municipalities began writing building codes that assumed stamped lumber as a baseline. And within a decade, the practice of milling your own wood for your own house had been pushed from the mainstream into the margins, where only the Amish, a handful of homesteaders, and a shrinking number of rural builders kept it alive. That did not happen by accident. The lumber industry benefited. The inspection agencies benefited. The insurance underwriters benefited. The mortgage banks, who started refusing to finance homes built with ungraded lumber, benefited. Everyone in the supply chain benefited. And the person who lost was the person who used to walk onto their own land and turn their own trees into their own house for the cost of gasoline and time. Not because on-site milled lumber failed, not because it collapsed, not because it burned down whole towns, but because a standardization push, coordinated between federal agencies and a growing industry lobby, made it easier to sell stamped wood than to defend the practice of milling your own. That is the pattern. And once you see it in lumber, you start to see it everywhere. Look at the lime story again through that lens. The same window, the same decade. Portland cement pushed into the countryside through federal highway projects, through the expansion of the ready-mix industry, through the post-war concrete lobby that positioned itself as the modern, safe engineered choice. Lime was reframed as slow, old-fashioned, unreliable. Cement was reframed as progress. And the two shifts happened in parallel, in the same years, targeting the same rural buyer, using the same playbook. Standardize the alternative, regulate the alternative, withdraw institutional support for the alternative. And in 10 years, an entire generation of builders will grow up not knowing the alternative ever existed. This is why that year matters. This is why that pamphlet matters. Because 1943 sits on one side of the shift, and by 1958, the shift is complete. 15 years. That is all it took to erase 2,000 years of building knowledge from the American mainstream. 15 years of quiet regulatory work, quiet industry funding, quiet extension office reprioritization, and one entire way of building a country was pushed to the edge of the map, where only a handful of communities still practiced it, and the rest of the population was told those communities were quaint. Which brings us to the third method, the one that contractors fear most, the one that eliminates the single largest line item on any modern build, which is not materials and not equipment, but labor. When a general contractor prices a house today, roughly half of what you pay goes to the people swinging the hammers. Cut that number to zero and the whole cost structure collapses. That is what Method 3 does. And the Amish do it every weekend. How do they coordinate 40, 60, sometimes 80 men to show up at sunrise on a single Saturday and put up a 3,000 square foot barn before dinner? How is that even legal? How is that system still operating in 2026 when the rest of American building has been priced completely out of reach for the average family? And why can any neighborhood, in any state in this country still legally do exactly the same thing right now if they knew how to organize it. That is where this story goes next. The Amish call it a frolic. That is the word, not a workday, not a raising, a frolic. And the word itself tells you something about how they treat the labor. It is not drudgery. It is not a burden. It is not something you dread on the calendar. It is closer to a celebration than a job. And that reframing is not decoration. It is the mechanism. Because when 40 or 60 or 80 men show up before sunrise on a Saturday, they are not showing up for money. They are showing up for each other. And they are showing up because they know with absolute certainty that when their turn comes, the same crowd will be standing in their driveway with hammers. This is method 3. No money changes hands. No invoices are cut. No time cards are punched. What gets tracked instead is days, informally. Sometimes in a small notebook, sometimes only in memory, sometimes only in the community's collective sense of who has given and who has received. A man who gives 8 Saturdays a year is a man the community knows. A man who takes without giving is a man who does not stay long. The system does not need a courthouse to enforce itself. It enforces itself through belonging. And what those Saturdays produce is astonishing. A 3,000 square foot barn frame, sheathed, sided, roofed, with the doors hung and the cupola set in 8 to 10 hours of daylight. Photographs of these raisings look almost fake. In the morning, there's a foundation. By lunch, there's a skeleton of oak. By dinner, there's a building, not a shell, a building, ready for use the next week. Now think about what that eliminates. When a general contractor prices a modern build, the largest single number on the invoice is not materials. It is not equipment rental. It is not permits. It is labor. Roughly half of what you pay for a new house goes to the people swinging the hammers, and another significant slice goes to the general contractor's markup on top of that labor. Cut labor to zero, and the whole cost pyramid collapses. That is what the frolic does. That is why an Amish house costs a fraction of an English house of the same size. Not because the materials are cheaper, though they are. Not because the design is simpler, though it usually is. But because the largest line item on any American build has been removed entirely. And here is what will surprise you. This system is not Amish. Not originally. Not exclusively. It is American. Stay with me. The barn raising, the husking bee, the quilting bee, the log rolling, the corn shucking. These are not folk curiosities. These are documented, primary source realities of colonial and frontier America. Every New England town record from the 1700s references community labor as the default way large tasks got done. Every diary from the Pennsylvania Dutch settlements describes it. Every Appalachian oral history collection preserved by the WPA in the 1930s contains transcripts of old-timers describing raisings, bees, and rotations. This was not a fringe practice. This was how Americans built the country. And it worked because the community was small enough, tight enough, and interdependent enough to make the informal ledger of owed days actually mean something. So what killed it? Not one thing. 3 things, converging in the same window between roughly 1945 and 1965, aimed at the same target. The first was mortgage lending. After the war, the Federal Housing Administration, together with the newly aggressive Veterans Administration Home Loan Program, standardized what a fundable house looked like. And a fundable house had to be built by a licensed contractor, from graded materials, following code, inspected at each stage. A house raised by neighbors on a Saturday did not qualify. You could not get a mortgage on it. You could not sell it easily. You could not refinance it, which meant functionally that if you wanted to enter the American middle class through home ownership, you had to build your house the industrial way. The community way was pushed outside the financing system entirely, and that shift did something bigger than just cutting off a building method. It changed what a house even was. Before the FHA standardized the American mortgage, a house was something you built and paid off with your own labor over a few years. After the FHA standardized the American mortgage, a house became a 30-year financial product, purchased from a builder, insured by a bank, taxed at a rising rate, and never fully owned in any meaningful sense until decades later. The frolic was not just outcompeted, it was made structurally incompatible with the new definition of ownership. And once the definition changed, the practice died on its own, because a generation grew up thinking that of course you needed a mortgage, of course you needed a contractor, of course you needed 30 years of payments. Of course, except that was not true a generation earlier, not for most Americans, and it is still not true in the communities that never made the switch. The second was insurance. Insurance underwriters, working closely with the same banking institutions, began refusing to cover owner-built or community-built structures. If your house burned down and you had built it yourself with your neighbors, the insurance company had grounds to deny the claim. If a workman was injured at a community raising, there was no workers' compensation, no liability coverage, and the host family could be sued into ruin. The frolic did not disappear because it was dangerous. It disappeared because the insurance industry made it financially catastrophic to keep doing it outside their coverage system. The third was building code. Between 1948 and the mid-1960s, municipal building codes across the country were quietly rewritten with heavy input from the National Association of Home Builders, which had grown into one of the most effective lobbying organizations in Washington. Those codes assumed licensed contractors, graded lumber, engineered concrete, and inspected wiring. They did not accommodate the traditional practices that had built America 100 years earlier. And when a rural county tried to keep those practices legal, they were pressured through state-level code adoption incentives tied to federal housing funds to fall in line. That is the three-part cage: financing, insurance, code. Any one of them alone would have hurt the frolic. All three together killed it in almost every community that was not deliberately organized around resisting them. Which brings us back to the pamphlet. Remember the 1943 Farmers Bulletin, USDA, distributed through county extension offices, documenting lime construction, on-site milled timber, and community raisings as recommended, mainstream ordinary rural practice. That pamphlet was not an outlier, it was part of a whole series. The Farmers Bulletin program had been running since the 1890s, and by the 1940s it covered everything from root cellar construction to homemade concrete blocks to small farm sawmill operation to the coordination of community work parties. And then quietly, between the early 1950s and the late 1950s, that entire strain of publication began to disappear. The bulletins were not formally banned. They were not seized. They were simply not reprinted. When county extension offices ran out of copies, no more arrived. When agents retired, the new agents were trained under a different curriculum, one focused on modern agricultural chemistry, modern construction standards, and modern financing. The old bulletins were pulled from circulation the way an old book gets pulled from a library shelf, without ceremony and without protest. But the bulletins still exist. They are in university agricultural archives. They are in the National Agricultural Library. They are scanned into digital collections that almost nobody browses. And when you open them, you find, in plain English, printed on federal letterhead, exactly the three methods this video has been describing: lime, on-site timber, community labor, documented as normal, documented as recommended, documented as the way Americans built things when Americans built things for themselves. That is the buried proof. Not a rumor, not a legend. A pamphlet series with a bulletin number and a publication date, sitting in an archive, waiting for someone to open it. Now bring it back to your property. Because here's what most people never realize. This system is not illegal. Not any of it. Lime construction is fully legal in every state in the country. And there are contractors, small ones, who still specialize in it. Portable sawmills are sold openly in every state at farm supply stores and equipment dealers with no permits required to own or operate one on your own land. And owner-builder exemptions, the legal category that allows a homeowner to build their own house without a general contractor's license, still exist in most rural counties in the United States. Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, Vermont, Alaska, Idaho, New Mexico, large portions of Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, and Georgia. The exemption is right there in the state code. It has been there the whole time. It was never repealed. It was just never advertised. Same with the National Register of Historic Places. Thousands of structures on that register are lime mortar buildings that have stood for more than 200 years, and they stand as documentary proof, backed by federal preservation records, that this material outperforms modern concrete over long time horizons. The evidence is public. The evidence is government maintained. The evidence has never been hidden. It has only ever been ignored. So what does this mean for you right now on the property you already own? Take a small example. A 12 by 16 shed. Standard size. Standard use. If you called a contractor tomorrow, you would be quoted somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000, depending on your region. Materials, labor, permit, delivery. Call it $8,000 on the average. Now build the same shed the three-method way. Lime binder for the foundation piers instead of ready mix. On-site milled or reclaimed timber for the framing. 3 neighbors who owe you a Saturday and are willing to trade. Your material cost drops to somewhere between $400 and $600. Your labor cost drops to $0, plus the food and drink you provide for the crew. Your total, all in, comes to under $600 for a structure identical in function to the $8,000 version. That is not a small saving. That is a shed that costs less than 1 weekend of a contractor's time. And the same math scales: a workshop, a barn, a guest cabin, a greenhouse, a small house. The multiplier is the same at every size. 90% off or more once you know the 3 methods and are willing to organize the labor. This is why contractors pray you never learn. Because the moment you understand that lime outlasts concrete, that the trees on your land are already framing lumber, and that a group of neighbors can raise a building in a single day, you stop being a customer. You stop needing the $8,000 quote. You stop needing the 30-year note. You stop needing the general contractor, the lumber yard, the ready-mix truck, the crew, and the payment schedule. You become something older, something more dangerous to the industry. You become a person who builds their own things again. So compress it. One last time. Slower now. Lime that outlasts concrete. Timber that grew on your own land. Hands that owe you a day back. 3 methods. 2,000 years old. Document in a 1943 federal pamphlet that stopped being reprinted in the 1950s. Buried under mortgage code and insurance rules and building industry lobbying. And still legal, still available, still functional in every state in this country today. You did not lose access to this system because it failed. You lost access to it because keeping it common cost powerful people money. And the fact that you have watched this far, that you have followed this chain of details, that you have not clicked away when the numbers got specific and the years got exact, tells you something about yourself. You are not the person who accepts the $8,000 quote without asking questions. You are the person who notices the pamphlet nobody reprinted. You are the person who wants the loop closed on your own property, with your own hands, with your own neighbors, on your own terms. And that is the type of person this channel is built for. So tell me, in the comments below, which of the 3 methods you would try first: the lime, the on-site timber, or the community raising. Because knowing which one you would start with tells you something about what kind of independence you actually want. And if this one felt buried, wait until you hear the next one. Because the Amish have a method for producing their own electricity, a method that predates the American power grid, a method that still works in 2026, and a method that has been pushed further out of public awareness than everything you just heard. Utilities pray you never learn about it. Regulators pretend it does not exist. And in the next video, we open that pamphlet too. Subscribe so you are here when it goes up.